Thank you, Beatrice, and welcome. We're very happy that we have a reasonably you here in such big numbers. My name is Moritz Schularick. I'm a professor here at Sciences Po and also the president of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. And I'm the least important person tonight because I'm just the moderator for a fantastic panel. And I'm just going to go in the order of the seating order. Alexandra Roulet is a professor at INSEAD. She was also until very recently President Macron's public economic policy advisor, just sort of left the Élysée to return back to the teaching trenches. And we're very happy to have her here and hear about sort of not just the French perspective, but definitely also what's going on in the minds and hearts of people in the Élysée. Then we have Lars-Hendrik Röller, who was, I should say, he's a professor at ESMT in Berlin, but he was for a long time Angela Merkel's chief economic advisor in the chancellery in Berlin, and someone who has shaped European economic policy for the better part of the 2010s, I should say. And last but very much not least, Arancha, who is our dean of the School of International Public Affairs. I'm very happy to have you here, professor at Sciences Po, and among many other things, former foreign minister of Spain. And so you already see we have a panel that has economists and international relations scholars, and all of the three here are not only sort of excellent researchers, but they've also done a fair share of public policy in the last decade or two. So we're very happy to have that combination, as Beatrice always reminds, of excellence in research as well as public policy roles and influence. We're going to start with a 5-minute statement. The question is Europe's future, Europe's role in a fragmented world. And you've prepared, I think, a 5-minute view on what are the challenges for Europe, what are the instruments that we have to deal with them, what's missing. And without further ado, Alexandra, and then Lars-Hendrik Röller, and then Arancha, if that's okay in that order. Yeah, please.
Thanks a lot, Moritz, for the introductions. Thanks a lot for the invitation. So just a few remarks to kind of start the discussion on the challenges that Europe is facing. So, I guess the first one is the fact that the world is becoming non-cooperative in many ways. So, of course, the rise of protectionist policies is just one example. We had a very good panel yesterday on economic sovereignty, where there was a presentation of Chad Brown making very clear what weaponization of trade can look like. And so in this respect, of course, as European members, we need to compete in this non-cooperative world very much at the European level, just because of market size, because of the ability to pool resources, etc. Now, it's also the case that I think a lot of the challenges that Europe is facing now are more and more common shocks. So 10 years ago, within Europe, we were facing a lot of asymmetric shocks, and now recently we have faced in some ways common shocks like the pandemic, like supply chain disruption, like climate change, and so on. So that's kind of a little bit a change and that also pushes us towards kind of working more and more at the European level. Now, the third challenge is, and not the least that we're facing is, and also that's not specific to Europe, in some sense it's a common threat in the world, is the rise of populist movements. So in some European countries, it's not a threat, is a reality. In others, like France, it's still it's still a threat. But the way we do things at the European level clearly has some impact on electoral votes, and it's not exactly obvious what the consequences of this statement is, but I think this is something that we should keep in mind. Now, I think there is a challenge that is also in some sense a bit more specific to Europe, and is the fact that in many cases, even in the face of common shocks, European countries have diverging national interests. And to a certain extent, as economists, sometimes we tend to underestimate a little bit this fact. So that creates kind of a discrepancy between the fact that among experts, among economists, there are a few questions where we very much all agree, and it seems like obvious cases what we should do, and then you look at the discussions in practice at the European level, and it's like endless discussion with which sometimes deliver an outcome, but with a lot of difficulty. So I can take two examples. For instance, last year during the energy crisis, when we wanted to, when there was this big surge in gas price, it was kind of obvious that we wanted, from an economic point of view, to do joint purchase of gas, right? And that was, the economic case was quite obvious, but the discussions were much more tricky, and in the end, we ended up with an optional platform. I mean, now it's no longer, the price of gas is no longer an issue, but it was harder in practice than what you could think theoretically, in part because, for instance, I think Germany was very concerned about quantities. We were more concerned about prices. That does not necessarily, made the discussion exactly aligned. Another obvious example is the reform of the fiscal rules. So from an economist, in an economist audience, we all pretty much agree that we had to reform the Growth and the Stability Pact to kind of move away from arbitrary numbers that were guiding our fiscal adjustments and move much more towards, relying on debt sustainability analysis and that allow us to differentiate between member states. Now, this is kind of the common principle on which we agree, and then you see the endless discussions, of course, that hopefully we will settle a deal before the end of the year. But I think as economists, sometimes we have a hard time fully. I don't know if it's our role. It's probably not our role to internalize these constraints. But the reality is really, I think that's one of the challenges that we are facing, is how to actually make efficient decision even when the economic case is obvious. And now, in terms of the instruments you were asking, kind of, and what should we be doing? I mean, I think, and probably we can keep that for the discussion. But one of the things we should really be focusing a lot, in my view, is, and that was said in several other panels, is the investment in public goods. And, kind of, as sometimes the presidents say, we are very good at regulating in Europe, but a bit less good sometimes at investing. I mean, we have, of course, Next Gen EU, which was a big success, but we have to think about what comes next. And in particular, coming back to this reform of the fiscal rules, I mean, in particular, if we settle on some numerical adjustments that still kind of are quite binding for some countries, in particular, for instance, for us, we have to keep in mind that this limits our ability to invest at the national level in public goods. So, the corollary of that is that we have to do even more at the European level. And I guess I could, I'll just stop there for the remarks, and I can keep
totally fine. I'm handing over then to Henrik Röller.
Thanks a lot. I'm wondering whether I should respond to what you said or tell you my 3 points worth, which I wrote down. I think I'll do the second. So I think the analysis of the world, I think, is quite obvious. I think we're moving towards one discussion, bipolar or multipolar world. I do believe it's more going to be of a multipolar world. If you look at how developments have happened, and clearly the world is, I'm not saying it's cooperative or not cooperative, it's just more complicated. And I think there are many issues. One of them is climate. I mean, we're just seeing that right now. It's very difficult to get to some kind of agreement. That was always difficult, by the way. That hasn't become that different, actually, in terms of the economics of it. Then you, of course, had the Ukraine war. You had COVID also. I mean, COVID, I was chairman of the WTO of a working group of fairness during, vaccinations. I mean, that we vaccinated our people, the British vaccinated their people, the Americans vaccinated their people. And it was a super global public good vaccination, if you think about it, and we weren't capable of doing it. And that really split also the West with the rest of the world. And now, of course, we have other geopolitical conflicts where, again, Europe sometimes is actually more isolated than I think it should be. So I think the world is really in a very difficult situation. Point number one, but I think we share that analysis. Point number two, still on the analysis, I think Europe's economic strength is relatively declining. I mean, there was some recent numbers in the media that, we were about as large as the Americans, PPP or not PPP, I think 2008. The Americans now have economy twice the size of Europe, and China, of course, is grown like hell. They do have problems, China. I think we should not, get too worried always about China. I think we need to do our own homeworks. So Europe is relatively economic strength is declining. I think Europe is strong. I mean, some of you have different views, but I was the economic advisor because of its economic performance. I mean, we're very bad on the military side. I think we should do much more. And Germany's doing more, but cooperating with France has always been a difficulty. Think about FCAS and the fighter jet, which they're still fighting over, I think, or not having an agreement on. So it has to be economically strong, and I'm worried that we're going to decline relatively, but by how much is something I think the economic policies of Europe is going to concern, and I think there also the next European Commission, which is going to have to set some priorities, is very important as far as Europe is concerned, also the personnel, which is, of course, always very complicated in Europe. So I think, multilateral, Europe's economic strength is declining, and there are lots of geopolitical risks out there. I mean, Donald Trump is one of them, but there are many other ones, and we don't even know about. That's why I'm worried about the fiscal side, because I think we do need to have firepower on the fiscal side, because the world is not going to get easier in the future. I don't believe in that. It's never been easier. It's always constantly been one crisis or the other. So that's my analysis. My instruments, very quickly, I think, again, I already said one, I think that the competitiveness of Europe, you might expect me saying that, I think that should be high on the agenda of the European Commission, so fiscal and investment and these kinds of things obviously play a hand in that. If you think about the energy climate policy, I think there are 4 policies you can think about: pricing, CO2 pricing, you can talk about it for days, regulating, subsidies, and you can think about the financial markets, private investment. And I think we should move the first and the last. We're doing too much regulation, and regulation is complicated. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's very convenient for politicians, just like subsidies are sometimes very convenient. We should do more of the first and the last one. So Europe's economic strength, we need to work on that. Is my, I'm not a government now, I have nothing to say anymore, but I think I'm worried about that. Second point is the geopolitical risks. I think we need to price them into markets, understood. Maybe we were too naive. And we were naive we obviously didn't do everything right. Think about energy in Russia. But we need to not go overboard with pricing in geopolitical risk. And when I look at many of the policies which the Commission, which is not an elected body, you think about the screening, you think about export controls, you think about economic security, which they're coming out with, all good. But I think we should not be going too far. I think we need to keep a certain sense of that, because it's going to cost us economically, and we should pay for it. But the question is, at what price do we want to pay for it? So I think when I look at it, and we can go through all the instruments, I would think we're going sometimes very, very far. And that's the point also that we are very defensive in Europe. We try to restrict. We try to protect our markets. Think about trade. I think trade, and you're an expert on trade, Arancha. There's not good news, I think, and trade has been overloaded with climate. It's always been like that. It's not something which has happened since Ukraine. Overloaded with climate, which is a good thing. Overloaded with all kinds of other things. It's very complicated to do a deal with Europe, because we are complicated. So we're doing a lot of defensive instruments, that's my line, and we should be much more offensive in thinking about how can we improve investment in Europe and be proactive and open up markets rather than trying to restrict technological flow, which I think one can do for, like the Americans, for very selected technologies, AI and others, but I think generally our posture is one of defensive rather than offensive one, which I think for the economy works better. Final point, and then I'm done, this fragmented world, going back to that theme. And I do think that Europe needs to play a constructive role here, would be my recommendation, my modest recommendation. That is, for example, reforming the international financial institutions. There's a big discussion in the World Bank and the IMF, WTO. And I think we need to be pragmatic here, because I think you've always been saying that, Arancha, very important. Also, even in the G7 and the G20, I think it was a good thing that we put the African Union into the G20. We need to open up to these countries. And their priority is not Europe anymore. We are not in the center of many of these countries anymore as Europeans. So I think that is very important. And the final point is that, and this is again maybe more pragmatic one, and the line is, it runs all through policy making. The perfect is the enemy of the good. You know, that we need to think, even with China, my view, I mean, you know, we need to think about areas where we should cooperate with them. We should shift. With Donald Trump, we did the same thing, by the way, when he was there the first time. We didn't talk to him about trade when we met him in the White House, because it's pointless, you know, especially if you're German. So you talk to him about things where you have a partial agreement on certain areas where you can work together. So I think if we can do a little like plurilateral agreements in trade, where we can think about sub-areas where the world can work together, we should do work together and need to work with all of them. I mean, bar North Korea and Russia at this point, but I think we need to work with all of them, and I think that's what Europe should work a constructive role. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Arancha, González.
So let me complement Alexandra and Lars-Hendrik with 3 points.
You can also complement if you want.
Complement and complement, let's say, the two. First on the diagnostics. I mean, I think the big problem we have is a greater share of security in the economy, a greater content of security into what was before more driven by efficiency. And that having a cost, and that having a price, and deciding where and who will pay the bill. So we have basically in front of us a more security-driven economy with consequences for the economy in terms of inflation, and needing for the EU the need to provide a response which I would say should be without panic, given that in reality the economy is proving to be extremely sticky. Global value chains are proving to be very sticky. So let's imagine that in the diagnostics we avoid hyperbole. So what does Europe need to do? In my view, and that's the second point, Europe needs to essentially hedge its weaknesses and invest on its strengths. So how does it do that? In my view, in a four recipe. First, economic security seen from Europe has to be targeted. It has to be acupuncture and not bazooka. Hence, my abandoning hyperbole. Second, I think the EU has to play for its strength, and its strength and a big source of its resilience is called its single market. And I do hope that the next cycle, the next European Commission, will pay more attention to the single market as a source of resilience for the European economy. Three, it has to double down on energy transition and on circularity, because it has a big gap and a big, let's say, competitiveness gap on the energy front and on the absence of raw materials, hence circularity. Fourth and final, in my view, the EU has to double down on building more trade infrastructure, both multilaterally, but also at the bilateral level. And this is only logic if you see a continent that essentially depends on foreign markets more than the average of China and the US for its own growth. Now, my third point, where is Europeans' problem? Where is Europeans' Achilles heel? It's not on the economy, it's on the political economy. It's on the ability that it has to play to address these four ingredients. And this essentially requires the European Union addressing a trilemma, what I call the national illusion versus the European springboard, the idea that especially bigger countries in the EU with bigger budgets may think that they can do this as a collection of national actions as opposed to truly European action. The second trilemma, which is investments versus debt, where some see investments, others see debt, and that is hugely paralyzing at the moment. I would want to hear Lars-Hendrik a little bit on that in a moment. And the third part of the trilemma, which is the illusion of sovereignty, of independence, as opposed to the management of interdependence. So, Moritz, to me, what Europe has to do is address the political economy conundrum that, in my view, will give the EU the competitiveness that it can build on the assets, but also hedging better the liabilities that it has.
Great. Let me come in and by the way, prepare your questions. We obviously have this interactive, and we have microphones, I think, at some point in the room. Arancha, you talked about acupuncture versus bazooka. Although bazookas have become very popular in recent years, so this is a moment for acupuncture. There is a related word by Jake Sullivan of the small yard, high fence, sort of the idea that we, for geopolitical or resilience reasons, carve out very small areas. So let me ask the panel: what is in your yard? What is in your small yard where Europe should have a high fence? What areas are in there? What is or Arancha, if I can ask you, where is the acupuncture treatment still needed?
I think the acupuncture is on critical, and the word critical is the one that matters. Not every trade relationship is dangerous or critical. Not every industry is critical. Not every sector is critical. Now, of course, this is tantamount to saying, how do you delineate what is effectively economic competition from where you put the cursor on your economic security? Security, I would say, is with capital S. And let me tell you where I come on this, and where I come from on this. Having spent a lot of time on the World Trade Organization, where national security was capital N, capital S, we've now driven this national security to be anything from cars, aluminum, socks, or shoes becoming national security. So to me, it's a narrow definition of national security. Obviously, there is a big part of this within technology, especially there where the fusion between civil and military is more evident, which is where we obviously, given a more geopolitical or rather rival world, is where, in my view, where we should care about. I obviously can add to that list critical raw materials that we need and which we do not have. And this is also a big specificity of the EU when compared to the US or China. So, but to me, the important word is critical.
Yeah, just it's interesting that it's actually relevant again. Donald Trump, when he imposed tariffs on Europe, which are still there, by the way, on steel and aluminum, which they were trying to get rid of, I think, also recently. They haven't been able to do it for obvious reasons, because of political reasons in the US. And I think Europe has a good position on that one. But those were imposed under Trump in 17, I think it was. And he was threatening to do the same thing on automobiles, which of course made us very nervous, which he never did. So a lot of barking, but no biting, actually. And interesting question, is that also going to be, if it happens in Trump 2? Trump 1 was actually not so bad, was not good for Europe. He imposed those tariffs on steel, not only on us, but also, by the way, on the Canadians. And the Canadian Prime Minister was very emotional about that, based on national security considerations. So, you know, and that's why Justin Trudeau was very emotional. He says, look, Canadians died with Americans in World War II side by side, and now you're imposing tariffs on us on national security grounds. So these arguments about national security, they always play well, and they've always been there. And I think our screening law in Europe, if I'm not mistaken, is also not economic or industrial policy. I mean, if it's industrial policy, call it industrial policy. But it's actually, the German law is public interest. So we didn't call it national security, we called it public interest. So there are all these things which can be very easily abused in an environment like this one, where obviously the population is quite concerned about the rise of China and the decline of Europe. And so that's why I like Jake's point. But, that's just talk. Obviously, Americans are usually about action. Is small yards and high fences. But the problem, of course, that's a slippery slope. And I think they've defined also AI, I don't know if that's critical. I mean, to me, yes, it's critical, but it's also very general. They've done quantum computing, so the Americans have defined these sets of technologies where they're restricting exports, quote unquote, to China, okay? And I think that we should be very careful going too far, that was my point, and following all of that. Because even if the others are doing it, and I can be accused of naive and old school, because we were against these things. Mostly the German position was on international economics, together with other countries. That even if others are doing it, it's not obvious that we build our economic strength by following some of these things. I think some of it is necessary, but we should be very careful. And once you put it into the hands of politicians, they have to define these critical in a very rigorous way. And if you go through some of these regulatory issues which are now being discussed, economic security is coming up. I mean, let's see what I think the first drafts are out, how far we're going to go that way. So my point would be, yes, that all makes sense, and it plays very well politically, but think about Europe's interest and how to develop the European economy and the technologies. To the extent that we need to protect it, let's do it. But let's not overdo it, because the pressure will be, the political economy will be to do too much. Politics is always from one extreme to the other. I mean, that's my experience. In the COVID crisis, we didn't have enough masks, and we had too many masks. Because, the political system is asymmetric. If you don't take care and something bad happens, you get killed. If it doesn't happen, it looks like you've done a good job preparing for it. So there's an asymmetric thing built in. So I think that we should be very careful with these national security. And on the critical issue, I always thought a useful thing, and this is why I think the Critical Raw Material Act, with I think the French Commissioner Thierry Breton, in all its wisdom, industrial policy wisdom, is proposing, which focuses on the inputs rather than the product markets. I think that is useful. I think I would be more worried about, so if I look at Daimler or Mercedes, they're selling a lot of cars in China. Fine, let them sell the cars in China. I mean, it creates a dependency, I would agree, but you can also try to develop other markets, which they're trying to do. But I'm less worried about selling a lot of cars to China, but I'm more worried about the critical raw materials which are used for batteries, where China actually has a monopoly of 9, which is what Breton is going after. So there I would be strong on industrial policy, but restricting trade on the output market, I would be very skeptical.
But precisely, I think that's where economists can help. So in defining, what's critical. I mean, we've seen this presentation by Isabelle Méjean yesterday. She has a methodology that, because of course the worry is lobbying and the fact that the choice of these critical inputs is not necessarily going to be driven by the good reasons. So this is precisely where maybe some independent economists can help actually figure out where are the vulnerabilities, and what we now have the data that allows us to do this. So in fact, I think that's one area where we can be confident in being able to define some of it.
Yeah, but the problem is that, I don't know how it is in France, but I think the link, we're back to this old topic, between good economic research and policy making should be improved. I guess that's your point.
Yeah, that was my...
So let me, one topic that comes up a lot when we talk about resilience and fragmentation is the role of the European single market. And it seems that's an obvious one. We could deepen it and we could become more competitive. I think that's what Lars-Hendrik Röller also had in mind. But then it looks like we've woken up in this new world. This is less rules-based and less multilateral, but for 15 years now, we basically haven't made progress on capital market union, on banking union, And I mean, let me give this question to Lars-Hendrik Röller, because it's been very much the Germans who have been, for fiscal reasons of fiscal policy or whatever fundamental objections, not been very, let's call it, enthusiastic about the prospect of banking union and maybe a little bit more about capital market union. But also there it seems that like petty players are kind of preventing big European steps. What is your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think one is the whole fiscal debate we're having right now. You mentioned that, and I can give you my view on that, which wouldn't be very surprising. And then there's the other issue, is why we don't make progress on some difficult dossiers. And I haven't been there for 2 years now. One of them was capital market union. We were very positive on capital market union, but I think there were all kinds of interests there which were difficult to resolve. On the banking union, it's not my view, it was the view of the official German government before, is that on the common deposit insurance scheme, we didn't want to go as far as some of the proposals, especially, France was very supportive of that. There are also asymmetries in the markets. It's going to affect the German banks. The German banking system is a different one than the French one. And I don't want to defend it, but it's just a fact. And that's why we had, so we proposed some intermediate steps, which may have been taken. I'm not really up to snuff in terms of what happened on common deposit insurance scheme. So the idea is, how much do you share risks across countries through the, because we have a deposit insurance scheme in Germany, which is a little different than the European one, because it actually insures not the depositors, which you might argue as an economist, that's what it should. It actually protects the German savings banks, the so-called Sparkassen. And this is something which has been there for 100 years, and some people argue, not me, that this is an important part of the German competitiveness in financing the economy of small and medium-sized firms. I don't agree with that, but that's the argument. But I don't want to belabor that point, but I think the point is very, very true. I think that in looking forward, I think the new commission, and I will have nothing to say, obviously, but I think that something like that, I mean, some of you were here when this happened last time, some internal market or a new program, but you need to have a sexy political, you cannot just say we want more internal market, because this is what we've been saying for years. But maybe some clever people can think about how to push that forward. And I do think that is obviously the right way to go, because I think the best China policy is having a strong Europe. And I think having an internal market will help that. We can talk about the fiscal side, but I think I'm going to be in the minority on that one. So
we can talk about
I will, and I'm not part of the government anymore. So.
But that's okay.
Hasn't changed actually much, That's amazing. So we're having a debate in Germany, which some of you know. And look, I mean, I like the debt brake we have in Germany. I think you can talk about making it more flexible. The debt brake in Germany, as you know, allows you to have a structural deficit of 0.35%, which is pretty low. And that's, but it's structural. So if the economy does well, you can make more debt that year. And this year, I think it's 20 billion. Next year, it's 20 billion, which you can legally increase your deficit, your debt, within the debt brake. So the debt brake has some flexibility. You can make it more flexible. And then there's a possibility, I don't know whether you probably all of you know that you declare an emergency, and then you can borrow as much money as you want. So there's no debt brake. And for that, you just need a simple majority in parliament. But changing the debt brake in itself would mean a 2/3 majority, because it's part of the German constitution. We did that in 2011. We were very proud of that in the middle of the financial crisis. They were going to put some kind of stop to politicians spending money on useless things, which may not be true. Politicians may be spending things very smartly. I've been in politics for 10 years, and I've seen huge amount of waste in terms of where money goes. So I think we can make it more flexible, but I kind of like it. There are two more reasons why I think, because we do need to worry about future crises. And I think we have a good German fiscal discipline that helps us in the current crisis. And the other thing is that when you looked at the German budget, this is what convinced me the most, by the way. So I had, I was from the Chancellery, my people were looking at the budget. And every year on investment, infrastructure, we didn't spend the money which we had allocated in the budget. So the problem was not that we didn't allocate enough money or borrowed enough money off the markets, it was actually getting it done and spending it. And that is irregulation, bureaucracy, it takes forever. So given all of that, and now the mood is flowing in a different way, we need money, we need the future, we need to invest, I understand all of that. I still think some kind of debt break is a good thing. Now in Europe, it's a different story because some of European countries are very highly indebted. And anyways, yeah.
Yeah, so I will reply to this one. I mean, I guess the point of the reform is there was kind of few principles behind. One is European reform. One is country kind of ownership of their debt trajectory. I think this is quite important in kind of at least two respects. I mean, and so that's when you're saying we have to stop, we have to put limit on like spending in useless stuff. Well, I think that
was true in Germany.
But I understood. But at least what's for sure is I don't think at the European level we can. This is something. What's useless or not useless is something that has to be decided at the country level because there's a whole history of how you get there. What are typical spending patterns, and even though you can change it a little bit, there is still going to be a lot of differences across countries, and that's kind of where the second principle comes in, which is to allow for this differentiation. And I think that's the reason I think this reform is actually important is I think this is one that can have direct impact on the rise of populist movement, because if you put numerical safeguards that are which in the end will happen, but the reason why I was not keen on these safeguards is that I think if you put them that they will constrain your action to a point that that may not allow you first to meet the challenges, invest. You can always redeploy spendings, but not to the extent that of the amount that we need to actually face the challenges of climate and so on. And on top of that, you really don't want to do anything that would be too much on the austerity side, not just for economic reasons, but I think also for political reasons in the moment that we are in.
Arancha, can I ask you to come in here? And it seems that you all agree that the world is shifting before our eyes, and we've woken up in a very, increasingly in a very different environment with strategic actors that are not necessarily subscribing to, sort of the win-win logic of global economic integration. But then, I don't know what the audience thinks, but listening to you, I think we're deep down into the same old European debates we've always had, and it feels like the world is changing and we're just discussing the same things we've discussed for a decade. And where's this going to go? Why is there not? Where is this? Why isn't there more of an realization that maybe defense integration has to make a big quantum leap? That maybe that necessitates some kind of fiscal union. Why is there so little enthusiasm or just urgency to be more European?
No, I mean,
or does this just depend?
Let's say that Europe has been procrastinating for a while, essentially on 3 areas, and the 3 have come to roost at the same time, and it doesn't make it easy for the EU. We've been procrastinating on enlargement of the EU, where we said we would, but then we dragged, and now it has become not only an enlargement necessity, but a more security-related necessity, a more geopolitical necessity. So the need hasn't changed, but the urgency to do it and the reason why we need to do it has changed. Defense has been the big procrastinator. We were not even spending as much as we said we would spend belonging to NATO. And now, in particular, since Donald Trump became the president of the US and we realized the fragile investment we had made on the most intimate alliance that one can have, which is the one related to security, we realize with then war in our vicinity, that this is no longer possible to procrastinate. And we've seen incredible moves on the defense spending, including across the European Union, sometimes in terms of budget spending, sometimes it's been in membership to NATO, or even in renouncing to, or even in entering the EU security and defense space. The third one is the EU single market, where we've been also procrastinating. Now, I can give you a lot of intellectual reasons why we've been procrastinating. If you look at the list of crises that the EU has had to manage since 2008, I mean, it's pretty phenomenal, starting with the 2008 crisis, the Euro crisis, the Brexit. Let's not forget that we also had to put a lot of political energy in there.
I agree.
At Donald Trump, at COVID, so in my view, we are coming to the point where we need, as Europeans, to take responsibility in these three areas. And it's either that or declining. I don't think we are in decline. I think we can be in decline if we do not address the three political and rather economic, but also political, geopolitical priorities in front of us. So I think our task now is to maybe reframe the reason why we need to do this. I mean, when I look at the horizon and a possible Donald Trump version 2, I think it would give us maybe a bit of a political incentive, additional political incentive to move. So we have to reframe the why we need it, and we need to put more urgency into the task. We just need to look around our neighborhood.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think Europe doesn't have options. I think Europe is, as you say, I think there are areas where Europe should improve, and the Commission, I think, is the proper place of doing it. I think defense is a big issue. Also, if you think about Donald Trump, and there are some people who are saying, he's been talking, not clear what he will do, but leave NATO. Germany, I don't know, France is different, but Germany depends completely on the Americans militarily, because our fighter jets have the nuclear option. Nukleare Teilhabe, we say in German. We have our this is why we fought with France about the Eurofighter versus buying the American fighter jet, because the Americans give us the nuclear bombs, and we put them underneath the fighter jets, and it has to be licensed by the Americans, and the Americans want us to buy the F-16 or the F-32 or whatever the next one was, right? And France was very upset, because why don't you wait until we have the next Eurofighter develop, this FCAS project, which is taking forever, because we have national interests. France wants to use its own industry, and we want to use our industry. But we depend, the upshot of this, this is a little bit upshot of this difficulty we have to agree on something, basically means we're completely dependent on the Americans. And if the Americans don't give Germany any nuclear shield anymore, you can talk to some foreign policy experts, and you think about Putin and all of that, we are in trouble. So one possibility is, of course, that we slip under the French. But we are totally, and if Donald Trump decides to do something like that, we better be ready. And I think working more on defense is a big issue. This is, if you think about the lessons of the stupidity which we did, which is not knowing that Putin was going to start this war. If the lesson from that is that you need to think about what are the big future risks, then that is one of them. But then it's not enough to just know the future risks. Everybody knows the future risks. You just read a lot of smart people who tell you this. You need to then politically act on them, and that is not easy. So we would actually have to do much more together on the defense side if we want to hedge against that kind of risk. And I'm sure they're talking about it, but are they doing it?
But to some extent, it sounds like a classical coordination problem. We also, like in industrial policy, we want to you know, ideally, I guess if we want to do it, we want to do it on a European level. In the defense, we want to capture the economies of scale that are there, that the Americans get and we don't. Now it's 27 countries buying 2 more tanks each. I don't know if that gives us much in terms of defense capability. Anyways, but that's a big question. So it's late, I know. You've had a long day of great talks, but I'm going to open it up if there are any questions. Over here, if we can get a microphone. Bea, please. Jean, and let's challenge and have questions for our panel, please.
Thank you. Thank you for a very nice discussion introduction. So I come from Brazil, and you know, I think honestly you guys should be a bit more cheerful about Europe.
Can you speak up a little bit more?
I come from Brazil, and honestly I think you guys should be more cheerful about Europe. I mean, we got Bolsonaro and got rid of it, so things move. Now, there is, of course, in the global south, and Brazil is part now of the global south, a bit of resentment against the West. And Europe is considered as part of the West. So in order to sort of maybe find an angle to differentiate yourself, is it possible that, you know, among the ways in which you could be more cheerful is precisely by sort of finding the right way in which Europe strategically could differentiate itself in the West vis-a-vis the global South? Now, of course, I'm not suggesting there is a war, there is security reasons on this front. It's sort of a no-go. But think of, let's say, two or three, or let's say 2 areas where this could be done vis-a-vis the global South. One would be you have a sort of huge network of public sector, public development banks, including European development banks, the EBRD, the IB. I mean, would it be possible you have the Finance in Common Alliance at the Agence Française de Développement? So is there a possibility that in the differentiation, one way, one avenue would be to explore more European financing to the global South in terms of, let's say, the type of investments, infrastructure, green financing that Europe could provide, and of course, financing the mitigation and adaptation strategy of the South. This would be a way to differentiate Europe vis-a-vis the West. The second avenue could be, for example, climate. I mean, Europe has very strong institutions there and willingness and plans. You have a well-functioning ETS carbon market. Let's say helping the global South in these areas. Perhaps maybe, I don't know, creating a European climate agency. I think we are all missing a coordinating agency in this area. And that could be a way in which Europe could differentiate itself from the West and perhaps sort of creating sort of a new type of dialogue with the global South, and that I'm sure would help at the same time international relationships, a bit more coordination. It would, of course, help the global South, but it would also help, I think, Europeans to find a sort of meaningful ways in which it can reconstruct its sort of cheerful spirit of the beginning of all this. Thanks.
Great. I think we got the question. So where can Europe differentiate herself, and what maybe also like what role between the 2 superpowers should we? How much room for maneuver do we have? Maybe you want to start, and then Arancha?
I mean, just quick reaction, but that's exactly the spirit a bit of the summit that President Macron kind of organized last June to try precisely to be a leader in terms of helping the global South meet its climate goal and not have to choose between fighting poverty and preserving the planet and trying to help with the financing. And the way it was kind of viewed is not so much creating like European funding or agency or whatever, but more pushing in favor of reforming the governance of the institutional of the World Bank and all these all the international financial architecture in order to make the voice of the global South more heard. So I think clearly Europe is but not so much in kind of differentiating and acting on its own, but more kind of being the leader in that direction.
Yeah, and maybe being a bit more understanding. And it's, I very much agree with Alexandra on the finance. Add to that oceans, which is another topic that France is also championing, where there are a lot of countries in the south that care about protecting marine spaces that they see as important for their future. Add to that medicines. If you look at where there is additional production capacity now, in particular in Africa, has been through investments that Europe has been spearheading, both in terms of know-how, R&D, but also investment. So, I mean, I think we have climate, finance, oceans, medicines, and a little bit of trade in the mix too. Let's not forget that. I think it makes for a powerful mix. Now, is not there here too. Europe has to be careful how it does it. Let me give you an example of something that Europe has not done well. Europe cares about protecting the forests. So do many countries in the south. Europe has produced a regulation on deforestation that is very problematic for many countries in the south because it obliges them. It's a one-size-fits-all that has been conceived in Brussels for application in countries that do not have the means. So I think we in Europe need to be much more sensitive today to using the space that we have to build alliances with other countries as being part of the resilience building and being intelligent about how we do it.
Great.
I think one point, Mercosur might actually help, passing that trade deal. This is something which we negotiated in 18, finished negotiating in 18. It's not happening. So it might be a good start.
Bea, please. And then Jean and Francesca.
So I think I agree with Luis that there could be a bit more cheerfulness on this panel, because after all, Europe hasn't done so badly, right? I mean, after all the risks that you mentioned initially, those were risks. Maybe at some stage they have materialized into large symmetric and sometimes also asymmetric shocks, and yet we are here in 2023 and can look back on those and say, well, they weren't so badly managed after all, and Europe did not fall apart with Brexit, and neither did it fall apart with the euro, and yet, and maybe this is mostly to you, Lars-Hendrik, I mean, over the last 10 years, since I was in the Deutsche Sachverständigenrat, my impression is that nevertheless, front lines have hardened. Germany has become smaller rather than larger. It is thinking less of Europe. Its fiscal position is totally dug in. And, 10 years ago, there was a fear that the German taxpayer would have to pay for it all. Now, 10 years later, it didn't have to, right? Is it because Germany is so, what is happening? Why is Germany not becoming more European?
Yeah, why is Germany not become more European? I don't know. But I think you're making a very good point. I mean, Europe has done incredibly well. We've done very well in the past. The quality of life in Europe is very high. So it's the greatest continent in the world. At least that's what we think. I'm not sure if you ask others. But I would agree with that. It's very resilient. It's remarkable. Okay. CEPR, it's just incredible. My point is only, and I'm positive, and I'm a good European, and I like Europe, also like France, also like Germany, is that I think if you want to do an analysis looking forward, I think the world is changing a little bit, and the challenges which are coming to Europe, I think there's some opportunities, I would agree, with the Global South, but the challenges are there. And I do think that it's important that we know this and that we take the right decisions in Europe. And then if we do that, I think hopefully my main point is we do these decisions. If people vote right, In the end, a lot is about who gets, Donald Tusk, great. Poland. You look at the decision which we just took on Hungary. We just decided, apparently, at least the Commission yesterday, to give Orban the 10 billion, which they've been withholding from the funds because of rule of law concerns, because they're worried about. He also met with President Macron, by the way, and probably also Scholz, because on Thursday and Friday we have a very important summit in Brussels where they will decide on the help for Ukraine. And Orban has been blocking that. He got re-elected, so he's very confident. So, but then we have Poland, which is great. We have the Netherlands, we have something there. So I think if you look at all of, if the people vote right, and if the politicians do a good job so that the people feel comfortable with the right kind of people, then I think we've got a bright future. But it's not going to be easier in the future for Europe. And that's why I thought I was supposed to say something like, what are the challenges moving forward for Europe? I think the good news is it's all in our hands, because we've got all the things we can do. And I think we need to just do the right thing. And so...
Jean, are we doing the right thing?
It's going back to the fiscal side.
Or do we have the resources to do the right thing?
I was...
Louder, please,
I'm a bit concerned when I hear that the single market is a strength. And I look at the numbers and I find that the crossing of a national border divides the intensity of trade by a factor of 5, which is exactly the same factor controlling for economic weight and distance. And that's exactly the same factor as the one we find between the US and Canada. And that after so many attempts, and the banking union, capital markets union were mentioned, I could also mention energy. The intensity of exposure to sun and to wind varies enormously across Europe. From that factor, it's 1 to 3 for sun. And despite that, there are more solar panels in Germany than in Italy. I mean, it's the cost of these things is just gigantic.
I agree.
So we're not getting our acts together. That's perhaps my first comment. My second is, are we able to define our interest? The US would say our national interest. And I'm afraid we are facing difficulties defining our common interest. And that's critical in this kind of situation. I mean, we've got to be clear about what are the priorities and what we are ready to give for advancing our priorities. So how do we define our stance with China? Is it the same as the US, China? The way the US sees its interest with China, I doubt it is. But are we able to define in a precise way the stance with China? So those are my questions. I just want to add one point, and that's a minor point to Lars-Hendrik. When you said you were part of this WTO, or you were chairing this WTO working group on vaccines.
On vaccines, yeah.
Why is it that we were not able to pay for the whole vaccines for the South? Why was the G7 unable to do so?
I can tell you.
It would have been a fantastic investment, both in economic and geopolitical terms. Why is it that this opportunity was missed?
So basically, so just to answer his question, so that was a situation where we didn't have enough vaccines. They were the production plans. We had BioNTech and Moderna, and BioNTech in Germany, we had 1 billion doses, I don't know, per month or something, if I get this wrong. So it was just enough to vaccinate the Germans. And then actually Brussels got very upset with the Germans, which our health minister, Jens Spahn, who's actually still a prominent politician in Germany, he's very good, that we don't say that publicly, but basically, I mean, the chancellor is writing her book, maybe it's in the book now, basically said, I don't want this to be a German procurement, we need to do this European. And there was a lot of resistance inside Germany because obviously we could have easily vaccinated, so nationalistic. And of course we had the same thing at the European level. We had a task force at the European level, it was in Brussels. Von der Leyen, is very much involved in getting vaccines, which is now a problem for her, I think, maybe not a big one. So they got a European task force with the goal to get Europe vaccinated. All of that a year later was no problem anymore, but the question was, this is, what are we talking about, end of 21. And then at the G20 meeting, we decided to create an international task force at the WTO, which was shared by Germany and South Africa. The reason it was South Africa, because Ramaphosa, together with Modi, they came forward with a proposal, which was very difficult for us, that these called a waiver, the intellectual property rights, WTO issue, we should waive them. So basically that these drugs, these vaccines, could be produced by anybody. Now my company said they can't anyways because you need quality control, blah, blah, blah. And we were very much against waiving intellectual property in such an emergency situation. And then we got killed internationally, particularly the Chancellor, because he was very vocal on that issue. I still don't know why, because as there's this intellectual property, you can have different views. So then we created this task force. And in the task force, we were thinking at the G20 level, how can we create more fairness? Because the world was totally divided. And the British, they got all their vaccines for themselves. The Americans did not export anything. In fact, they passed a law which forbid their companies to export vaccines. Europeans actually did export quite a bit. So it was a complete nationalistic response by the world in a very catastrophic situation. And then I was thinking, what can you do to improve this? And obviously you cannot expect from a democratic government to not first think about their own people. Maybe you can, but it's asking a lot from a politician under that kind of pressure. So you need to think ex ante, before the next crisis comes, what can you do to prevent this nationalistic behavior from happening again? And this is why we talked about localized productions. So we started building some plants in Africa. Because it makes it credible that you actually produce in those countries. So it was a disaster, I think. It turned out to be, they had 3% vaccination rates in Africa, while we were at 60-70% in Europe. And the Africans were saying, help us, and people dying. Anyways, it's a different issue.
So having been having to complain about Jens Spahn wanting to do a deal between 3 European member states to vaccinate their citizens as opposed to 27 EU member states, I can tell you that it wasn't nice. But to your question, Jean, on the single market. The single market is a huge resilience source for the EU because it has different production capacities, different investment profiles, different scales profiles, and in a one political community. That's the source of resilience. But this resilience is below the potential of the single market. Now, it's not just capital markets. Take services. Yeah. Take recognition of diplomas. If we are thinking of skilled labor, You need to have the mobility of this skilled labor with their diplomas. So there is a huge busting exercise to be done with this single market, because at the end of the day, for all Europe's ambitions to be a geopolitical actor, the EU will not be a geopolitical actor if it is not a geo-economic actor. So my advice to the next Commission should be, start by building, investing, deepening your firing capacity on the geo-economic side, and that will give you more credibility geopolitically than pretending that you can build huge capacity in the short term on the military side, which we know will take time. Second, to your question about definition of common interests. It's easier to define what your common interests are when you find a common enemy. And there's going to be a good chance next year that we find ourselves with a bunch of common enemies. Enemies, please, enemies. That, in my view, can give us a bit more political ammunition to move forward, because, to Beatrice's point, yes, we've been muddling through, but there is a cost moving forward in continuing to muddle through when the rest of the world is doing a step change. That is what we need to understand, and we need to share with our public. Now, finally, we do have an issue of not having a policy on China. Saying that we de-risk instead of decouple is not a policy. That's a political statement. We don't have a policy vis-à-vis China. And I just received on my WhatsApp the latest salvo from the US about a policy on China, and it's called, and I quote, "A strategy to win Americans' economic competition with the Chinese Communist Party." So here, at least, there is a view. In Europe, we still have to build it.
Francesco.
One specific issue on Europe versus the US. Even
Louder, you need to be very close. I'm
sorry.
Yeah. It's like basically swallow it.
Sorry. A specific issue on Europe versus the US, even before enemies appear on the horizon, we have a very specific industrial policy issue, which is how to respond to the American subsidies. Now, we need to do it because there are a number of European firms that are deciding to relocate their plants to the US to get Biden subsidies. This first they relocate the plant, and the next thing they do, they move to the US. So, in my view, the obvious way to do it is to scrap or reduce the limits to state subsidies, because with limit to state subsidies, you cannot do that. And then the issue is how you do it in a situation where different countries have different fiscal space. And the conclusion of this view is that it is obvious that you scrap state subsidies and you do something like Next Generation EU. You use European money to subsidize firms that the Commission decides are worth subsidizing. I think we're still very far from there. And before we agree, we've lost a number of European firms, even before Trump comes.
So maybe was your question related also to the IRA and how Europe should respond, or different? Because then I would say, like, maybe have a last round on, there's a challenge of friends doing policies that might not be what we think. How should Europe respond? You want to start, Alexandra?
No, but I totally agree with you. I mean, that's kind of what we have been pushing for in response to the IRA, and there was still this Industrial Act last February. So, I mean, it is the problem is indeed if you remove a state aid limit, it's basically all to France and Germany. So, and mostly Germany. So that's you need the mechanism to preserve from the fragmentation, and that's not as easy to get and to agree on. That's where I kind of, that goes back to me a little bit to my initial point about the fact that at the end of the day, I feel like what we have not yet fully managed is to find a slightly less painful way to overcome our diverging national interests. Because, what you're saying is that it would be welfare improving, and then it's just like you redistribute. But this is economists, the way we think about it, and I fully agree, but then it seems to me that in practice, in the negotiation, is always much harder to push that logic.
My view on that is a different one. I don't think we should start the subsidy war with the United States. And I'm not sure it's so much in the interest of the United States. This Inflation Reduction Act, which is a lot of money, it's also flexible, so it could go up even higher. Whether subsidies are the way to create competitive advantage or comparative advantage, something you can debate. So I think there are other policy instruments which would work better for Europe, and not starting to subsidize people to stay here if they really don't want to stay here, or to counterset that one. So I'm more on that line, even though one should not be naive. I think we should not be, of course we are subsidizing like crazy. If you look at the amounts of money we have on climate in the next generation, I don't actually, it's comparable to the US. So I don't think we are less subsidized. I think we're subsidizing actually too much in Europe. I'm a big fan of the state aid rules. They've been softened and softened and softened. So I think that's the wrong policy instrument. This relates back to the fiscal discussion also. I think there are better ways. Less regulation, more integration, more CO2 pricing with the social redistribution to people, creating innovation. I think those are, so it's not a subsidy. And therefore I think that, and the other issue, I completely agree that Germany is the biggest subsidizers of all of them because we have we are the biggest economy. And I don't think that is even good for Germany, so I would not be in favor of that. So tough state aid rules, I think this is a comparative advantage for Europe, not a disadvantage.
So, on my side, I would say it's not all gold that glitters. That's what the British say. So let's look at how much the EU Commission has approved in state aids. 700 billion in state aids approved. That's more than the IRA. So, where is the upside of the IRA? Easy to use, easy to sell. Where are the weaknesses? First, political fragility. We already hear noise of what a maybe successor to President Biden could do with this. And the other fragility, in my view, is that it has not built the backward and the forward linkages that the subsidy to manufacturing requires, including on a skills building. What you hear a lot of businesses in the US tell you today is that there's a huge gap that they have in being capable of using the mechanism.
I think I forgot that point, but this is very important. The way you do the subsidy is just a simple tax break in the United States. Whereas with us, it's endless negotiations with the European Commission who try to interfere into what France would want to do. I think I think that's the main difference. So if I would not do more subsidies, I would do better subsidies.
Good. I think this was a fascinating panel. We all have a boat to catch. Bea and team are taking us on a little cruise up the river. The buses leave at 7. But I mean, from
so should we continue?
The same place. And I was instructed to close on time. But if you want another round of questions, we could also do that.
No. I just want to correct my earlier statement. They leave at 7, okay. And from the same place as yesterday. For those of you who were yesterday, right on the corner of Saint-Guillaume and Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Okay. So there is a bus going to be there. Yeah, to your right. Correct.
Wonderful. So then let's give a hand to our fantastic panel. Thanks a lot. I learned a lot.